Hello, students. I hope you're doing well. This is not going to be a lecture quite. I would call it a video note. I'm just giving you a note. Maybe it'll be long for a note, but short for a lecture. Anyway, I want to give you a verbal citation since I've asked you to give me verbal citations. We want to talk about Plato's dialogue Phaedo right now. This is the translation that we find in the book Five Dialogues. All of the dialogues are written by Plato. This book is published by Hackett. The publication date is 2002, right? And this is the second edition of the book. This is translated by G.M.A. Grube and John M. Cooper. And John M. Cooper is the editor of the book. Okay. We want to look at a small part of the Phaedo that runs from 72E to 75E. These are the Stephanus page numbers, right? I believe I've mentioned them elsewhere. I'm sorry if I haven't. Um, they're based on a Renaissance edition of the complete works of Plato. Probably haven't mentioned that part. His name was Stephanus, right? So these numbers are in the margin. Look for the page number in the margin. And again, we want to look at 72E to 75E. These are standard across different translations and different editions, so they're very helpful page numbers. Okay. So there are two main things going on in this small stretch of text, and we want to disentangle them, keep them separate, or make them separate. Plato doesn't separate them very much. There's the theory of recollection, which has something to do with the soul being immortal. I don't really want to emphasize that because I don't think that gets us what we want, but we will talk about recollection and figure out how it works and how it might work even if we don't have immortal souls. The second thing we want to talk about is a theory of the forms. We won't flesh out a full theory of the forms. Remember, the Euthyphro told us something about the forms, but we people who teach Plato often, we consider the forms in Euthyphro to be part of Socrates' own view, right? So Socrates has this idea that there are forms or mere appearances that things have in common, and that's why we call things by the same name, right? Now, in the Phaedo, we're looking at a more Platonic view of the forms. The forms are eternal and perfect in their kind, and they seem to have an existence of their own. So, this is a more elaborate theory of the forms than what we got in the Euthyphro. Okay, so to sum up, so far we're saying there's a theory of recollection and there's a theory of the forms. We want to say something about both, and we want to separate them to some extent. Plato runs them together quite a bit in this stretch of text. Okay, so what is recollection? How does it work? Well, basically, recollection is when one thing causes you to recollect this other thing that isn't present. So the first thing is present, here it is. Maybe it's a human, maybe it's an image of a human, maybe it's a harp. And then its presence triggers your memory of something that isn't around at this moment, right? And so you recollect the second thing based on your exposure to the first thing, okay? So there are a few examples of this in the text. A lot of them involve Simmias and Cebes, so let's use them. So these are some of the young men that followed Socrates around, they're evidently very tight. Maybe they're lovers, maybe they're close friends. It's not entirely clear from the text, but everybody sees them together all the time. That's clear, right? Um, so we might see Simmias and we might recollect Cebes because we're seeing Simmias. So in that case, like causes us to recollect like, or in other words, Simmias and Cebes are both the same kind of thing. They're both human beings. So sometimes that's how it happens, right? This kind of thing causes you to recollect a different instance of the same kind of thing. One human who's present causes you to recollect another human who's not present. It could happen that way. Or, Simmias could see Cebes' harp, or lyre is the word in the text. It's a smallish harp. So Simmias could see Cebes' lyre and think of Cebes, right? Could recollect Cebes, right? Wasn't thinking of Cebes, didn't have him in mind, didn't have him in consciousness, but saw his lyre and then thought of his dear friend, right? And so he's recollecting based on the presence of the lyre. Sometimes a mere image of something causes us to think of the real thing. So Cebes might see a picture or a drawing or a painting of Simmias, right? And then he thinks, oh, Simmias, a good friend. Wished he were around, right? So he recollects Simmias on the basis of the image. So sometimes things can be far apart. They can be quite dissimilar, and yet the one causes us to recollect the other. That's a basic model of recollection. Now let's switch to talking about the forms, and then we'll go back to recollection. Okay. Now, the form at issue in the text is the form of equality. Okay, so what's going on with the form of equality here? There's this question about equal sticks and stones. So sometimes we see equal sticks and stones, and then we think of equality. So this looks like a kind of recollection. Let's again put that aside for a minute at least. Um, Question before us right now is these sticks and stones, are they making us think of something similar or dissimilar? Let's focus on that. Are they putting us in mind merely of themselves? Maybe they're putting us in mind of other sticks and stones that were also somewhat equal, but not completely perfectly equal. Or are they putting us in mind of something else? Okay, well, sometimes we've got sticks and stones, and maybe I look at them and I think, well, this one looks roughly equal to this one. But someone else could look at the very same sticks and say, well, no, I don't think they're quite equal. Look, this one has a little knob here that this one doesn't have, right? And so they're not exactly equal. So sometimes two sticks are equal in a certain respect, but they're not equal in other respects. Sometimes two stones are equal in a certain respect, but not in other respects. Maybe I'm just trying to use the stones to weigh something down. Maybe I'm using them as paperweights. And as far as I can tell, they weigh the same. And so I say, well, they're equal. And then someone else looks at them and says, what are you talking about? Look, this one's metallic looking, and this one is a dull granite color. So they're not equal at all, right? My point is, in the real empirical world, it is often the case that things are only roughly equal. In fact, Plato would probably say, if we asked him, and I'm not saying this is even the correct view, but I believe Plato would say, if we asked him, well, they're never really equal. right? In the real physical world, you could always find some difference. Get out the microscope, or the magnifying glass. Let's look really carefully. As part of Plato's view, it seems that real world things are typically deficient in this respect. They participate in equality, but they're not perfectly equal. Okay, well, what's the point? Well, the point is we were asking this question about when we look at the equal sticks and stones and we think of equality, are we thinking of something similar or something dissimilar? Are we just thinking of all the sticks and stones and how they were roughly equal in certain respects and unequal in other respects? Or is there this other thing at issue, this thing that is equality? Okay, well, there's basically an argument in the text as Socrates goes back and forth with, I believe it's Simmias. It is Simmias who wants to experience recollection. Okay, he already believes in it. He's been hanging out with Socrates a long time. He's already adopted a lot of Socrates' peculiar beliefs, let's call them. Okay, so Simmias thinks that recollection allows us to recall things that we don't experience in the empirical world. Or, in other words, taking it back to the equal sticks and stones, um, Simmias thinks that we can recollect something that is unlike the equal sticks and stones, and in fact could never be exactly like the equal sticks and stones, but it's its own kind of thing, its own kind of reality, its own what it is. That's actually a phrase used in the text. Okay, so let's go over that. Socrates is asking Simmias about recollection. Simmias says, I want to experience it, even though he already believes in recollection. He already believes in recollecting the forms on the basis of empirical stuff, observed stuff in the world, right? Anyway, Socrates asks him about the equal sticks and stones. Don't they make you think of the equal? Yes, says Simmias. Doesn't it seem like the sticks are trying to be equal, but they're not quite making it? Yes, says Simmias. So they go back and forth, and they agree that in general, things in the world that are equal are just roughly equal, but they are striving toward actual equality, right? Now, here's the argument that separates the forms or Platonic forms from stuff in the world. Um, so any two sticks you like, it seems, um, could be equal in some respects, but are bound to be unequal in other respects, or even if they're equal from one perspective, they're bound to be unequal from another perspective. So when it comes to equals in the world, lowercase e equals, those equals are also unequal, right? So well, always in the world, equals are unequal, but also at the same time, unequals, well, those sticks are dissimilar, but maybe they do weigh the same. Maybe they're perfectly the same as paperweights, right? So those unequals are equal. Okay, so this is what we get in the empirical world. We get equals that are also unequal. We get unequals that are equal. But Socrates keeps pressing Simmias, well, could it ever happen that equality is inequality, or could it ever happen that inequality is equality? Well, no, Socrates, those are opposites, right? The point is, equality is a standard or a governing principle, right? We have to measure the sticks against a fixed standard to determine whether the sticks are equal, right? But where does the fixed standard come from? Well, Socrates and Simmias end up agreeing that it doesn't come from our sensory experience, right? Because our sensory experience gives us equals that are also unequal, and it gives us unequals that are also equal. But we have an idea of equality itself, which would never be unequal, and we have an idea of inequality itself, which is the opposite of equality and would never be equal. Right? So we have these different standards, we have these different ideas, and if we didn't have them, we couldn't judge of the sticks whether they're equal or unequal. So where do these standards come from? Well, they're recollected on the basis of our sensory experience. Okay. Now, Plato has an elaborate theory that the soul is immortal, and so it beheld equality itself and inequality itself when it wasn't in a body. And so we're literally recollecting or remembering things that we experienced when we were disembodied. Now, this is where I want us to disentangle things, right? So I think we can simply read this passage as a pretty good argument for abstract objects. That is to say, this idea that equality could never be the same as inequality, but they must remain opposites, while at the same time, equals in the world could also turn out to be unequal, unequals could turn out to be equal. That all seems correct. So we can't collapse the standard, this abstract idea of equality, into empirical instances of equality, right? And we can't collapse the abstract standard of inequality into particular instances of inequality because, again, equality can't be equal to inequality. Then our words are meaningless because the problem can be generalized, excuse me, right? Because things that are big are also small, and things that are tall are short, and things that are visible, are invisible because their external surface is visible and the internal parts are invisible to us, right? And so on. So, taking this into ethics, just institutions always have some injustice in them. People who exhibit courage, we might find some little bit of cowardice in them in certain situations. On and on it goes, right? When we see examples of things in the world, like the big or the small, or the tall or the short, or the just or the unjust, the pious and the impious, when we see things like that in the world, we see mixed instances. It's just and it's unjust. It's pious and it's impious. It's big and it's small, right? So if the words big and small, pious and impious, if they are to have any meaning, then they can't just collapse into the empirical instances, into the mere examples. So there are abstract objects, there are standards, intellectual standards that we use to judge things in the world. Where do those come from? Well, they don't have to come from an immortal soul that beheld them when it was disembodied. they could be part of our mental furniture, right? In other words, it may not be the case that all of our ideas come from sensory experience. Some of them could be innate, some of them could be fixed, right? They could be there ready to be triggered when we're born, right? So Plato literally believes that the ideas are put in the soul before it's born, and then you get reminded of them because you see these things that are somewhat similar, but also dissimilar in the experiential realm, right? The realm of sensory experience. I would rather just say our mind has certain ideas that it needs to operate well, right? And equal and unequal are pretty obvious candidates for fixed innate ideas that we use to judge our experience, but they don't come from experience. Why don't they come from experience? For the reasons in the text. Because the equal can't be the same as the unequal, but equal things can definitely be unequal in some respects. Okay, so that's what I want you to get out of the text. We've got some idea what recollection is. We have some idea of what Plato's forms are. We have an idea of how the forms are recollected based on things that aren't the forms, but we can divorce all of this from the idea of an immortal soul. And I don't mean to say that souls are mortal or that there aren't any souls. I mean to be agnostic about all of that, right? When you're trying to make a case for something in philosophy, you want to commit to as few things as possible to get the desired conclusion. Now, for me, the desired conclusion is there are abstract objects. We'll call them the forms, right? So we can get rid of the idea of an immortal soul, and we can get rid of the idea of a disembodied soul that was somehow hanging around in a realm of forms without its body. We don't need that stuff. That stuff could be true for all I know. I'm not saying it's false. I'm saying what interests me in the passage is the existence of these abstract objects. I think there's a really good argument for the abstract objects here. Okay, and that's the main thing I want to leave you with. Thank you.